All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SIPA. I'm Erin Banco. We're really excited to have you all here for what I'm sure will be a really exciting event. Like I said, my name is Erin Banco, and I'm a student here. I've been to Syria twice to report and spent the majority of my time in the Middle East reporting on the war in Syria. When I came back to school this semester, I wanted to continue the conversation in some way. When I first started thinking about planning this panel, I knew that I wanted students to have the opportunity to learn about multiple different aspects of the crisis. And I think tonight's panel will facilitate that. We'll begin the event by Skyping with Rami Jara, who is a Syrian opposition activist based in Istanbul. Hopefully that will go through. And then we'll move on to the panel. And after that, we'll leave about 45 minutes open for Q&A for anyone who has questions. I also wanted to mention that the work you see here tonight was done by James Duggan and Jake Naughton. Can you guys stand up so everyone can see you? Two photojournalists who have been to Syria and back. Their work. So they will both be available after the panel if anyone has questions about their work. All right. Well, I think we're gonna start. Our moderator is Dipali Mukhopadhyay. And we have a really fascinating panel here tonight, and I'll let her introduce everyone on the panel.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. First, a very big thank you to Erin, who single-handedly has pulled this event together. So this is what we love to see happening at SIPA, and we're very grateful to her for all of her work. My name is Dipali Mukhopadhyay. I teach at SIPA in the International Security Program and have primarily done my research on Afghanistan, but have begun some research this summer on Syria. And so it's a great privilege for me to be a part of this event and to be facilitating, hopefully, a fruitful discussion about the situation in Syria. I think we're going to start with Rami Jara, if he's available, but while Erin is trying to get him on Skype, let me just introduce our panelists to you in alphabetical order. We'll start with Jean-Marie Guénaud, who is the Arnold A. Saltzman Professor of Professional Practice at the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and the Director of the Center for International Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and at the Center for International Cooperation at NYU, and serves as the chairperson of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva. In 2012, he worked with Kofi Annan as Deputy Joint Special Envoy for Syria and left that position to become chair of the French Commission that prepared the white paper on French defense and national security that was released this past spring. As the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations from 2000 to 2008, Professor Guénaud became the longest-serving head of peacekeeping and led the largest peacekeeping expansion in the history of the United Nations. We then have, to my left, Carolyn S. Miles, who is President and Chief Executive Officer for Save the Children. Save the Children is the leading independent organization inspiring breakthroughs in the way the world treats children, achieving immediate and lasting change in their lives, serving over 85 million children in the United States and 120 countries around the world. We also then, to my right, have Professor Michael Oppenheimer, who is clinical professor in the Global Affairs Master's Program at New York University. He is the originator and director of the Carnegie Corporation-funded Project on Alternate Futures for Pivotal Countries, which includes Syria 2018. He has done extensive consulting for the U.S. foreign policy and intelligence communities and for think tanks, is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior consulting fellow for scenario planning at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Next, we have to my left Lara Satrakian, who is the co-founder and executive editor of News Deeply. She spent more than 5 years as a foreign correspondent covering the Middle East, reporting jointly for ABC News and Bloomberg Television. Times Magazine has dubbed Syria Deeply, which is her first platform focusing on the fusion of news and technology, as, quote, the future of news, while Fast Company said it, quote, outsmarts the news business, redefines crisis coverage. Laura Satrakian is currently a fellow at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, serving at its Tao Knight Center for Digital Journalism. And finally, we have Liam Stack, who is the editor of Watching Syria's War, which is a New York Times multimedia project that tracks the conflict in Syria through reporting, social media, and citizen videos. He covered the Egyptian Revolution and the revolutions in Syria and Libya for the New York Times and is a former correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and Daily News Egypt. And you can follow Liam on Twitter at Liam Stack. Okay, so we will bring Rami Jara in after our panelists who are with us today will speak. So what I thought I would do is direct some general questions at different clusters of people on the panel so that we can have a more focused conversation. For me, as I began doing research myself about Syria, one of the organizing principles that has driven my questions about the conflict is this notion that we as scholars and journalists, as diplomats and policymakers and practitioners, find ourselves in the position of trying to understand, influence, and ultimately help resolve this vicious civil war from the outside in. So most of us cannot be on the ground engaging with the parties directly in a sustained or transparent way. And what will motivate the questions that I want to pose this evening is this idea that there are a new set of challenges that come with that kind of intervention. And I'm interested in hearing from the panelists about what those challenges are and what kind of space for innovation has opened up in their different sectors and areas of expertise as a result of this idea of trying to engage with the war from the outside in. So I was hoping to start with Laura and Liam and ask them this very broad question, which is how should we, as outsiders looking in, go about understanding this war? There are so many groups. Events seem to be constantly evolving and changing on the ground. Very few people with expertise seem to be able to maintain a sustained presence on the ground. The sources for the coverage that we receive often have very real biases and agendas in the information that they're presenting, and we imagine that we're probably missing the perspectives of other parties to the conflict, whether they are regime supporters or members of Al-Qaeda affiliates, for example. So it would be great if each of you could kind of paint a picture for us for what you see is happening on the ground, but speaking in doing that to the ways in which you as journalists and analysts have overcome the challenges of covering this particular kind of conflict. And so I'll ask you if you can keep your remarks to about 8 minutes, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning, if that's okay. And so, Laura, maybe you can start, and then we'll go over to Liam.
Sure. I would love to dive right into what's happening on the ground in Syria. So I'm going to move very quickly through what I think you need to know about the information deficit that we've seen in the course of this conflict. By way of backstory, I was covering the Middle East for ABC News and Bloomberg Television through the Arab Spring, and I found that toward the end of the Arab Spring, you already had media fatigue around these issues. Unfortunately for Syria, it came last in this chronological sequence of revolutions. And as a result, there wasn't too much bandwidth left to cover Syria's uprising, what would later become a civil war. And that's a critical point because we were already missing the picture from a complex country that already had very little specialization. There aren't that many Syria specialists in the United States to begin with. So it was already pretty complex to understand where the whole picture started. I was then reporting. I was very happily in a TV job that any one of us would enjoy if we were in the craft, but I didn't think that the state of play was acceptable. I did not think that we were even close to capturing what was happening in that conflict. I have family with roots in Syria. I care about people in Syria, and I care about Americans who want to understand what's happening to people in Syria. So that motivation for people on both ends of the story, and this basic fact that in the state of American journalism, I had never seen a case where the consequence of an issue was so high and the comprehension was so low. And that was a very dangerous gap for everyone involved. this is a highly consequential war. And 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when my family was living in Lebanon, it would have been inconceivable for ABC or the New York Times to close their bureau in Beirut. But these days, it's considered relatively special to send one reporter to a refugee camp when there are 22 million people left inside. So I took a pause from television to create SyriaDeeply.org, which we thought would be a volunteer project. We'd all put our heads together, journalists and technologists, to design, as close as we could, a 360 view of what was happening so that Americans, especially coming to the story for the first time, could see the history and the background and the who's who, a kind of on-ramp to the key issues. That's served us extremely well. It's created a neutral, what we call an outcome-neutral platform. You know, we don't take a position. We didn't take a position on U.S. strike. We just don't do that. But we have become a kind of online convening power. So we will always cover what Save the Children is doing, some of the best work on the ground. Doctors Without Borders, the same. We have cross posts from the Council on Foreign Relations. But most importantly, we have Syrian journalists on the ground. There was no reason to think of them as fixers or helpers. They are journalists in their own right. All it took was engaging them and helping their writing, in some cases, just make that one extra leap, that extra 25% to become global grade reporting. So that's what we started to do, and now that mixes in with our own reporting and analysis. When we feel the need to do a Q&A with Save the Children or someone else, it's mixed in with that reporter in the suburbs of Damascus who's telling us that people are so hungry they are literally eating leaves off trees, or that a 13-year-old we just profiled in the northern part of the country is now teaching his own middle school class because he's the best and brightest in the classroom, so he stepped up to play the role of teacher. And when he goes home, he tutors his sister at night. So his workday isn't done. And we've covered kids in Lebanon who are selling stuff on the street, who can't afford the $4 a day to go to school. And we're covering the refugees, but to the greatest extent possible, we're trying to get a spread of folks inside the country who can share what's happening, both in regime and opposition-held areas. I do still have family in the country. They actually live in regime-held areas. So it was very important to me up front that when I think of my Christian aunts and uncles who might have a certain opinion, because we assume that Christians have a certain opinion, that when they saw Syria Deeply, I was half worried I was going to get emails saying, "Why did you launch the Revolution blog?" But they got it immediately. The need for a platform like this was immediately apparent. We started getting Facebook messages in Arabic, "Please start translating into Arabic." We turned down grants. We had a clear policy, no U.S. government funding and no regional funding, because patronage and press are a very bad combination in that part of the world. So we started just taking requests. Okay, you know what? We're going to start translating what we can. We started Arabizing some of our content, and over time creating more of a conversation and a flow of folks who reach us because they want to put themselves on the record, taking a position. We've briefed top lawmakers. We did a Google Hangout with John Kerry just before he went to Geneva for the talks to resolve the chemical weapons issue. I elected to pull in Nick Kristof at the New York Times and a teacher that we work with to ask questions from U.S. classrooms about what was happening in Syria. From day one, we took the content from Syria Deeply and turned it into an open lesson plan for social studies teachers so that they could teach Syria in the classroom. So Syria Deeply became Teach Syria, and that put us on our way. Now, I told you that whole long story really as an instructive sort of example for how you need to understand Syria, which was DePauli's question, which is as a scatter plot. Everything you see about Syria is one point on the scatter plot. It is a very complex picture, and if you care to understand, you have to you roll up your sleeves and understand the sectarian groups and why things have transitioned a certain way over time, or watching Syria's war to understand what the videos have shown over time, because they're not one-offs. They tell a story. The rebel group formations, how have they trended over time? Everyone has a piece of the answer. No one has it alone. And I think that's kind of postmodern journalism at work, but it's also a factor of how difficult it's been for any one of us to grasp what's happening. I know that a lot of what folks like Save the Children and Mercy Corps and great groups doing great work, they sometimes, have to keep quiet because they need to protect the work they do, but they're probably closer to the reality of what's happening than any news organization right now, because they are in it, and they feel it, and they know, and they hear from people, and they're consistent. The press isn't consistent on Syria. So that's why when you understand this, it's really got to be a scatter plot. You know this, you understand that, but fit it into a framework and do the very best you can to create a framework for yourself so that when these pieces of information come in, you understand them as such. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. Liam?
No, Well, thank you for having me here tonight. I think a scatter plot is a great metaphor for what's going on in Syria. And I think when we talk about the information deficit, that really is, in some ways, I think the primary obstacle we really have as journalists, as policymakers, as activists. The project that I work on, Watching Syria's War, is a New York Times effort to identify videos, pieces of social media, citizen video, that are meaningful and say something about what's happening in Syria right now, to identify them, collect them, curate them, report around them, and try to figure out what they say, what they can teach us about what's happening. The videos that we post, they come from a variety of sources. You earlier mentioned possibly al-Qaeda affiliates as being somehow inscrutable. In some ways, they're actually the most prolific when it comes to social media and citizen video. Those guys are, very effective at getting their message across. But yeah, so the project takes video from regime supporters, regime fighters, al-Qaeda affiliates, civilians caught in the crossfire, refugees who may be living in, I said earlier, Egypt or Jordan or Turkey, and really tries to tell us what we know about them. And I think the project is valuable, and this way of doing things is valuable, because at a really basic level, so much of what we know about Syria that you see either on network TV news or you read in the pages of a newspaper or magazine, so much of that is based on this kind of secondhand viewing of these sources that are often not really digested critically. They're not really analyzed. They're kind of seen as, little snippets of, almost a movie. I mean, they are technically movies. And there's not really an effort to kind of, A, verify them, to say, is this real? How do we know? Are there any red flags here? And B, to kind of say, how does this fit into the larger narrative? And does it make sense? So that's where Watching Syria's War comes from, an effort to make sense of this flood of videos. I mean, at this point, I'm not sure what your estimate would be, but I would say probably hundreds of thousands of videos have come out from Syria, from all sides. And they really are our only entryway as outsiders into this conflict. The work that Syria Deeply has done has been amazing. The Times also has some staff inside Syria working anonymously. And we have a very large team in Beirut, very talented journalists, and also in the border zone in Turkey, who are able to go in occasionally. But I think, these videos are not relied upon out of laziness or out of over-caution. I think that there are very serious risks that you have to take to go in and do a good job in Syria. Certainly aid workers are taking those risks, as are journalists, but it's difficult. It's very difficult, I think, to gain access to rebel-held areas, especially as more extreme militant groups have risen in prominence, as has the risk of kidnapping. I mean, just today there was news of 2 French journalists kidnapped in Raqqa. I'm sure their captors would say they were arrested, but, potato, potato at a certain point. So there are those risks. It's also very difficult to get permission as a foreign journalist from the government to enter regime-held areas and to do work that is not completely impeded by regime minders or by security forces. As I say that, the Times bureau chief in Beirut, Anne Bernard, is currently on the ground in Syria and doing a great job, but these are little windows that open up a possibility before the government slams them shut again. So it is very difficult. And I think, to answer the second part of your question, how to overcome these challenges or how to be creative in the face of them, I think things like what Lara is doing in Syria Deeply is a great example of that. I think Watching Syria's War, the project that we run at the Times, is a good example of that. At a certain point, you have to take what you have and make the most of it. And that's certainly true as the media, journalism as an industry at large is faced with diminishing returns year after year, and the space for doing that kind of work financially, quite frankly, collapses. So I think taking a critical eye towards the material we're getting, whether it's video, whether it is the ability to Skype in and talk to someone who may be thousands of miles away, you have to kind of take these things with a grain of salt and try to piece the puzzle together.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'd like to now turn to Carolyn and talk about the humanitarian dimension of this, again, from that perspective of working from the outside in. Wondering, Carolyn, if you could describe to us a bit about how SAVE has been able to assess and then assist the millions of internally displaced people inside Syria? What are the kinds of challenges your organization has faced? And to the extent you can talk about it, how you have innovated, collaborated with other organizations, with neighboring countries, kind of creatively maneuvered around these challenges. And also, if you can give us what your sense is of how neighboring countries are faring with the 2 million plus refugees. And I guess more broadly, in your mind, does this kind of a humanitarian crisis pose unique or unprecedented challenges, or are you able to leverage lessons learned from past experiences, and to what extent you're able to do that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to Polly, and thank you to Aaron for putting this together. I can't tell you how important it is actually to see all of you in this room, because this is a humanitarian disaster on a scale that we actually have not seen for decades, but most people don't know that. Most people in the United States, certainly, and in many other countries, don't realize the scale of the humanitarian disaster that's going on. So one of the things that, I'm extremely grateful to be able to talk about this, and particularly with those who are interested in journalism, because you guys are the ones who actually can get the word out about what's happening. So it is a huge humanitarian crisis. There are now over 2 million Syrians that are displaced outside of the country, and it is a real crisis for children. More than half of those refugees are children. Inside the country, there are 5 million people displaced. So altogether, there are now about 7 million people displaced. I think it's about a third of the population of Syria. So imagine if for the United States we had 100 million people that were displaced inside of the United States. That's the scale at which we're talking about here. And the work that we're doing inside Syria is very difficult. So we're working mostly over the northern border from Turkey. We are working a lot with local organizations, and that is really important for us to work with all organizations that are trying to reach, whether it's the regime side or whether it's the rebel side, to reach those in need. And again, there's about 5 million people, and about half of them are children. So really important that we work with local communities there. We have staff that are going in and out of the country, but we have local teams on the ground that are staying there. And they are, as you can imagine, under extreme danger. We oftentimes have to stop whatever we're doing. We're doing distributions of food, medical supplies, water. There's actually a huge hunger crisis right now going on inside Syria, which, again, you're not hearing about. But people are being attacked as they're trying to get food. They're being attacked as they're trying to supply food. They're being attacked in bread lines. The production of bread is way down because we can't get flour into the bakeries. So there is a real threat right now, even to children, in terms of malnutrition, and very big, very high malnutrition rates that we're seeing. One thing to remember about Syria is this is a country that was really a middle-income country. So, I've been out to the region 3 times. I have not been allowed to go inside Syria by our team for safety reasons, but I have been in Iraq, and I've been twice to Jordan in the refugee camps there. And these, when you sit and you talk with families, these are families that just had normal lives. They, were painters, they were carpenters, they were teachers. And when you talk to them about what happened and where are they in the conflict, most people will say to you, I really don't have a side in this conflict. I just was living in my town, and I was having a normal life, and my kids were going to school, and then, the bombing started, and the school was destroyed, and the healthcare center was destroyed, and my house was bombed, and at some point I just had to leave. And that's what's happening to most people who are leaving, either internally displaced and they're moving inside Syria, or they're leaving to the refugee camps. And the work that we're doing is really focused on both of those populations. We're working in 5 countries around Syria. So we're working in Lebanon, where the situation is really challenging because there is not a refugee camp in Lebanon. It's basically families that are living in old deserted buildings. They're living in tents that they've somehow scavenged and put together. They're living in towns where residents have been, generous enough to let them live in their yards. Those kinds of situations. In Jordan, we're working in Zaatari, which is now a camp that is, I think, the fourth largest city in Jordan now. I think there are 150,000 people there. When I was there just about 3 months ago, there were 120,000 people there. So it's growing, continues to grow. There's about 5,000 people still going over the borders every day. Iraq, there are now 3 different camps in Iraq. So there's one in the northern, they're all in the northern part of the country, by the way. And the Kurdish government there, you mentioned, Apali, to talk a little bit about the countries that are supporting these refugee populations. Huge pressures on these populations. So if you think about Jordan, for example, the northern part of Jordan is a very poor area of Jordan. So the place where Zaatari is not a wealthy area. There are not only 150,000 people in Zaatari, but there are another 200,000 people who are living around that camp in communities. Huge strain on these communities. They were not wealthy communities to start with, so a lot of stress on water, a lot of stress on food, a lot of stress on jobs. Many of the Syrians are trying to make a living for their family. They don't want to live on handouts. They want to actually be able to do something. But the ability to get jobs in those communities is very tough. So the Jordanian government, I think, has done a fantastic job, actually. If you think about this again, I was thinking about this and thinking, what would the United States do if we had 300,000 people who came across the border into the United States? I have to tell you, they would not be doing what Jordan's doing. It is amazing what the government there has been able to support. The same in Iraq. Again, the Kurdish government in the north is really supporting all of these camps. The camp where I was designed for 10,000 people. There were 40,000 people. And when I sat with some of the families there, there were only most of the kids were not in school. These are kids now that have been out of school. This is another big part of this crisis. There are children who have now been out of school for 2 years, going into their 3rd year. If we have a generation of Syrian kids that do not get back into high school, that is going to be a very tough thing to rebuild in terms of their country there. I met with some of the youth. I think young people probably have it the hardest right now. So we have a youth center inside the Zaatari camp, and I met with some of the boys there, 15, 16-year-olds. And I talked to one of the boys, and he was telling me that he had been in high school, and he had been a good student, and his plan was to go to university. That was his plan before. And I said, well, what do you see as your future now? And he said to me, I have no future. I don't have a future. My future is this, and he pointed to the camp. So that's the kind of issues that we're talking about with children. It's not just about hunger. It's not just about education and getting into school. It's about Syrian children feeling like they actually have a future. And again, this is going to be a very tough thing to rebuild if this continues to go on this way. You asked, Apali, about cooperation, and I think in this particular emergency there is a huge amount of cooperation, not only with UN agencies, so UNHCR and World Food Program are the big actors from the UN, and UNICEF as well. There are not that many NGOs there. Mercy Corps, Save the Children, IRC, IMC, those are the big NGOs that are working inside the country and around the country. There are local organizations that are actually very good, and we're trying to bring those local organizations into the response in all the countries where we work. And as I said, inside Syria, they are probably our biggest and most important partners. So cooperation, really important. I was saying to Dipali earlier that one of the shocking things to me, I just looked at some of the numbers of kind of our response and the numbers. So we've reached about 690,000 people. More than half of them are children. And for Save the Children, that is a huge response. But when I looked at the amount of resources that we had raised, private money that we had raised, and I compared it to Haiti and the Japanese tsunami, it was about 1/100th of what we had raised for those emergencies. So again, very difficult to be able to respond to the scale of this kind of a crisis when most people are not thinking that there's anything they can do. I think one of the things I've been spending a lot of time on is talking not about, people are kind of seized on the chemical weapons piece and the military response piece. And what I've been saying to people is, it doesn't matter where you fall on those particular issues. Everybody can do something about the humanitarian issues that are going on in Syria. And that's about regular people, regular Syrian civilians who really are the ones who are suffering the most, and certainly children are really suffering in this emergency. So I'm really grateful to be able to talk about this and to have all of you be part of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. So I'll now turn to Jean-Marie and then to Michael about this, the political and diplomatic side of this, the idea of building a peace from the outside in. There seems to be consensus around this notion that there's no military solution to this war, only a political one. And I'm wondering if each of you could reflect on what that actually means. Do the parties on the ground actually believe that? And if they don't, what are the kinds of instruments available to outside actors to facilitate that realization? And some of the instruments that came to mind for me, there's clearly the threat of force that we saw leveraged recently by the United States. Quiet diplomacy inside Syria between the opposition, facilitating dialogue between the opposition and the regime. Some kind of consensus building within the region around what a future vision of Syria would look like. Building the capacity of the so-called opposition, whether militarily, politically, economically. And then, of course, there is kind of the diplomatic politics that takes place inside the Security Council and maybe most acutely between the U.S. and the Russians. So I'm wondering how much of this facilitation of the realization of a political solution, how much of it can be done from the outside? And to what extent is each of you concerned that there are real limitations of diplomacy when it comes to ending a civil war? And finally, if you could speak a bit about the movement on chemical weapons, to what extent you think that bodes well for the ability of the international community to intervene for the better as it relates to the conflict as a whole.
Okay, well, lots of tough questions. We heard about the complexity and about the immensity of the tragedy in Syria. And so I think that the utmost priority should be a quick end to the conflict. And the question really is, how can that be achieved? And so there comes your first question. Is there or isn't there a military solution? Personally, I'm convinced that there is indeed no military solution. And that has implications. Because if you pour weapons into the country, you can do it for two reasons. You can do it with the idea that you are going to beef up the camp that you support so that it achieves victory. I don't think that is possible, at least in any short run. So if one thinks that it should be an important goal to quickly end the conflict, that is not a good option. Another justification that you hear for support of delivery of weapons is to say, oh, we're going to create a stalemate. We're going to create a balance that then leads to negotiation. I think that is at best naive, at worst cynical. Naive because this conflict, as you said, is not just a conflict in Syria. It's a conflict in the region. It's a kind of strategic battle between the Sunni monarchies and Iran. And you can rest assured that whichever camp gets reinforced, the other camp will get parallel reinforcements, because no camp can see the defeat of the other as anything else than a strategic defeat, and will do its utmost to prevent that. So, more weapons, mean just more conflict, intensification of the war, which has killed 110,000, 120,000. We have stopped counting, but which could still kill many more, much more, actually. As horrible as it is to say that, but I think that's unfortunately the reality. So military solution impossible. But how can a political solution be possible? Today it looks less likely than it looked a year ago. The opposition has been certainly more radicalized, more fragmented, and so it's hard to see how one can produce in Geneva a coherent delegation that speaks for all the opposition, or even a major part of the opposition, and a major part of those who hold guns. And the regime certainly has shown its resilience. The talk that Assad was going to collapse has been proven to be completely wrong. And so both sides at the moment believe that they have no interest in negotiating, or that practically a negotiation is almost impossible to organize. So where does that leave us? Military solution impossible, negotiation impossible. The Geneva formula that was agreed in June of 2012 provided for a transitional government body agreed by mutual consent. These are the words of the communiqué in Geneva. Mutual consent between key leaders of the opposition and the key leaders in the government, it looks like a pie in the sky, frankly. I don't think, after all these rather grim description, I don't think that means that there is no way out. I think that the conclusion to be drawn from that is that the role of the international community, and the international community is a word that doesn't mean much, the role of the Security Council, to be specific, is today much more important than it was a year ago. Because a year ago one could have imagined a solution where there would be 30%, so to speak, of blessing of the Security Council and 70% of a negotiation between the parties. But at the time, the international community was just pushing the parties not to negotiate. Today, if there is ever to be a solution, it's 80% Security Council and then 20% with the parties. That's, in my view, the only way it will work. And to end on a glimmer of hope, and that's your last question on the chemical weapons, I do think that it's important that that agreement was reached between Russia and the US. Of course, there is a cynical interpretation, which is part of the truth, that if you look at it from Assad's standpoint, okay, chemical weapons are not so great to win wars. Hitler did not use them in the battlefield in World War II because they're not good weapons to win battles. And so you trade those chemical weapons, and that will relieve the pressure on you, and it's better to abandon chemical weapons than to drop chemical weapons than to drop Assad. That's part of the explanation. But that is not the end of the story. I think there is a realization, at least at the level of the great powers, of the big powers, that there is a stalemate. A year ago, that realization wasn't there. And that realization is a positive thing, because it means that they understand that if the war continues, it will just kill more people in Syria and spread to the region. And that focuses the mind, because that's a strategic threat for the United States, for Russia, and so they have an interest now in bringing the conflict down. That's the first piece of good news. The second piece of good news is Iran, which is, of course, Iran is a question mark and an enigma, and I wouldn't want to draw hasty conclusions. But the situation where Iran is today is no question better than where it was a year ago. And Iran is important as a part of the solution as it has been a part of the problem. And so when you put all that together, you can see how a concerted effort of the international community could lead not to an agreement between the parties, I don't think that's going to happen, but to an agreement on a process that would lead to the emergence of a solution. The process could mean transparent elections. Elections can be organized in refugee camps. They can be organized in there are ways to, elections under international supervision, something like that, possibly. But that's part of the negotiation between the key powers. And that is, at some point, a possibility. I think what's important is not just stalemate, but realization that there is a stalemate at the global level, then realization that there is a stalemate at the regional level, and eventually at the Syrian level. And then there is some hope. The question is whether for that to happen, we will wait 3 months, 6 months, a year. Because that's the difference between 150,000 people dead, 200,000, 500,000, and so that is not inconsequential, and that requires a lot of wisdom and political effort on the part of some of the major actors.
I usually enjoy contestation, disagreement. I revel in debate, but I don't have much to say in opposition to what you've just said. I think it is a stalemated conflict. It's also an escalating stalemated conflict. It's escalating and it's spreading and it's metastasizing throughout the region. And while one side may enjoy sort of a transitory advantage, a year ago you would have probably bet on the opposition. Now you probably bet on the regime. But the fact is that over time, the various parties to this conflict, not just two parties, but multiple parties, have sufficient resources of their own and or sufficient outside support to balance whatever advantages the other side may enjoy. So over time, it's stalemated, but it's not stable. It's violent, it's horrifying. It's the worst crisis the world faces today. And it's a regional crisis. It already is a regional crisis. It's a crisis in Iraq. It's a crisis in Lebanon. It's a crisis in Jordan. It's a crisis in Turkey. So the first answer to the question, well, how do you make it better, without assuming that we're talking about a political settlement, which I think is a bridge too far. If you mean power sharing and so forth, it's beyond hope. But the first thing you try to do is to get people to confront these worst-case scenarios. And that's what we have tried to do in this project that you mentioned earlier, that Carnegie funds at NYU, is to develop these kind of plausible alternate futures for, in this case, Syria, that insists that decision makers, not engage in wishful thinking or denial, but accept that to the extent that they don't engage, I don't mean militarily necessarily, but to the extent that they don't engage individually, more important collectively, that this will continue to spread, and the humanitarian catastrophe gets worse and worse. The region as a whole is subject to instability, and that as far as the United States is concerned, every one of those core interests that President Obama talked about in his UN speech are ultimately in jeopardy as a consequence of this, whether it's open access to oil and freedom of oil trade, or whether it's protection of allies, or whether it's non-proliferation, or whether it's counterterrorism. These are the four core things that he said the U.S. worries about in the Middle East. He didn't say Syria, by the way, but he did say those four things. Those four things connect to what's happening in Syria and what's happening in the region. So one of the responses really is being intellectually honest about what could happen here, and the implausibility of great powers avoiding the blowback from this kind of a crisis. I think that there is some hope, not in terms of the parties themselves, because the parties won't reach an agreement. That's clear. I mean, the regime may now feel sufficiently strengthened to sit down and talk, but they won't compromise. And neither the secular opposition nor the more radical jihadists will either sit down or talk. And so you have this multi-sided, fragmented, escalating conflict with none of the parties really with an incentive to make compromises towards a political settlement. But there is the makings of a consensus externally. So the U.S.-Russian Framework Agreement and the Security Council resolution to disarm Syria of chemical weapons is promising. I suspect the right thing to do here is at least to make sure you succeed in implementing that agreement before you start taking on broader objectives. But at least if it does succeed, it lays the groundwork for moving on to a more fundamental effort to dampen down the conflict inside Syria. So you hope that you can kind of stay on the straight and narrow long enough to achieve that disarmament, and then build on that consensus to go further. The Iranian opening is also, of course, quite promising. Again, I think that the initial strategy needs to be to just focus on the nuclear side, because that nuclear weapons agreement, if it's in the offing at all, has to stand on its own. It can't be justified in terms of things that we got or we think we're getting from the Iranians and helping out in Syria. But once you generate some momentum in those conversations, the Iranians might be brought in to be helpful in Syria. So I think there's some promise here, and you just have to be, you can't get ahead of yourself in leveraging these developments to improve conditions ultimately inside Syria. I think that's two things. One, confront downside scenarios. Two, build on these promising developments of consensus among external supporters of various factions inside Syria. I think you have to be opportunistic. It's not a stable stalemate, but it has the makings of sort of territorial patterns that might be the basis for some kind of an externally imposed, informal, perhaps, partitioning of Syria. It's not the ideal solution. It's not a permanent solution. But, it may be the best we do, and it would be a hell of a lot better than where we are now or where this conflict is going. And so I think that, having information which is good enough, and that's a problem because you don't have a perfect view of what's happening inside Syria. It's dynamic and it's uncertain and it's changing. But there may be opportunities here with the regime consolidating its control in western Syria to at some point come in at the right time and establish buffer zones between these forces and begin to dampen down the conflict. I think you have to be modest in how you define a political settlement. I don't think the party is going to compromise. I don't think outside parties can impose a political settlement on the participants. I think what you can do, if you have enough consensus among outside powers, is to start starving the conflict. Agreements on the chemical weapons agreement is a good example, but you build on that to reduce the arms pipeline, the conventional arms pipeline, to all sides. And you have to work very hard to get the Saudis and the Qataris and others into that agreement. But with a U.S., Russian, Iranian understanding that you are not going to be supplying arms at the level that you had been. Of course, that's easy for us. We haven't been doing very much, but it's harder for the Russians and the Iranians. You might eventually manage to achieve a de-escalation, not because the parties want it, but because they don't have the means to escalate. I think it's an outside in. It's in a sense it's an imposed solution. Solution's not the right word. It's not a political settlement, but it begins to establish more peaceful conditions inside Syria. Avoids the worst case scenario, which is that the entire region goes up in flames. And over time, you see how the country evolves. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes? Okay, so we are, for technical reasons, are not going to be able to have a Skype in, but so that gives us more time for questions from the audience. So I think we're going to have a microphone. We have a microphone set up over here. If you could please line up and introduce yourself in one line, what your affiliation is and your name, and please keep your questions pointed and brief so we can get the most number of people. And if you have someone you'd like to direct your question to, please make that specific.
Orange Urinkas, ex-Sovietologist, and therefore wondering why the Russians are more interested in the relationship with the Syrian government than their presumably improving relations with the Western powers. And one more question. Do any of you speak Syrian Arabic?
If you have a question, please come up to the microphone here. Does anybody want to take the first question about Russia? Yeah.
I'll take the second question. I speak Lebanese Arabic, but I think there are many deeper insights on this panel around Russia's role, but I think it's pretty clear that this is about much more than the Assad regime or the ports in Tartus for the Russians. This is about their standing in the Middle East, their standing in the world. I think they've achieved many of their objectives by sticking with the Assad regime, so has Iran for that matter. These are questions of leverage, and I think they've frankly succeeded in thumbing it to the West, but also in, creating problems only they can solve, which is something that I usually attribute to Iran, but I've never seen it play out in the Russian case, and now we've now seen that happen. Can I interview in Arabic? Yes. Superbly. I'm at a loss when you ask me how to say, Roquefort cheese, and I don't know how to say Roquefort cheese.
It's probably a cognate.
I can't, but I would like to respond on Russia. If Putin plays his cards right, and so far he's playing them quite cleverly, he may be able to both maintain his relationship with Assad and the security of the Russian naval base in Ba'ath-Istel territory, and improve his relationship with the United States, because after all, he came to the rescue when Obama came to the realization that he wasn't going to get a positive vote in the U.S. Congress to authorize a strike against the regime. So, and this is not necessarily a bad thing for us, but it's certainly a good thing for Putin. And what he has sensed quite accurately is that our administration, wants to stay as far away from engagement in Syria as it possibly can. And Putin offered an opportunity to do that in a way that was relatively unembarrassing. And so, the Russians are playing this quite well.
I would add on Russia, I think they have had from the beginning a different assessment of the situation. They have had for decades a fairly close relationship with the regime, a bit, let's say, like the United States with Egypt. A lot of advisors, connections with the various parts of the army, the security services. So they know from within the strength and weaknesses of the regime, and they are very concerned by the idea of a collapse of the regime. They think that an Iraq scenario must be avoided at all cost. They believe that Western powers have no clue when they want to evolve a country from outside, that they don't know what they're doing. They're not completely wrong. And so they stick with what they know because they think that the unknown is quite dangerous. And what we see as a downside of what we know is less of a downside from their standpoint. And they have also significant concerns on how Islamists could be strengthened in the Middle East. They see that as a direct threat to the territorial integrity of Russia, the situation in the Caucasus, and so some of them even would wonder whether there is some kind of conspiracy to use Islamists to hurt Russia in the way the Baltic states led to the undoing of the Soviet Union.
Just to underscore that point, if you believe some reports, there are Chechens on the ground fighting with the opposition. So now, at least in some narratives, you could say from Moscow that the Assad regime is fighting against Chechen terrorists. And that arguably the chemical weapons deal gave Russia and Iran more control over the Assad regime. For a while there, it really seemed to be going that direction where they might take advice from Russia once in a while, but Russia didn't have the strength to tell Assad to do anything. Now that, I think, has markedly changed, which means, as you were suggesting, you might have a global moment where you can untie the knot.
Yeah. And observe, by the way, that there's a fair amount of commonality in U.S.-Russian interests operating here. Chemical weapons, the radicalization of the opposition, the fear of ungoverned spaces. That this U.S.-Russian framework agreement didn't happen by accident. It happened because the way events on the ground developed in Syria, the two sides, the two countries began to understand that they did in fact have some basis for talking to each other about avoiding worst-case scenarios in Syria, right? Which for us is not, unfortunately, I think, but for us it's not an Assad victory. It's chaos. And I think the Russians see it the same way. And we will never admit that, but I mean, it would be a great irony if the reset ended up being built on the basis of a common set of positions on Syria.
Not there yet.
Not there yet, no, but you can see it. I think in these future terms. So that's where my imagination may be running a little overdrive right now, but that's what I can see emerging.
Hi, I'm Matthew Ray, PhD candidate, based in Damascus until January 2013. Just wondering, we haven't heard any word about civil society in Syria, which is really, very strong nowadays. Until 2 years of conflict, there's still more than 100 demonstrations every week, and we don't have heard anything about this. And also about what I will call the political side of humanitarian questions. Assad used humanitarian tool. He just starved people if it needs. And it seems like there's equal level between rebels and Assad, but Assad still rules the country. And there's something, some wrong balance in our presentation, I think, if we don't consider how the regime rules the country. And also a question about military interventions. Russian supply by weapons Assad regime. So why the opposition didn't receive anything from the beginning, even if they can conquer most of the part of the country? Even they don't have any bullets. But the regime can't reconquer any part of the country up to now, or you have to empty it. And we don't, there's no question on that point.
Let me ask Liam to start, and we'll come down.
Well, in terms of the question about civil society, you're absolutely correct. There has been really a flowering of a lot of different aspects of that. You mentioned protests that happen, and from my vantage point, parsing through all these videos every day, we do see many videos about that kind of thing. People will, film a demonstration that's happening in their neighborhood, often with a note card held up that says the exact location, the date, the time. There's one town in the North Kafranbil that's become famous for these videos of protests, but there's always jokes. Oftentimes they're very, lewd and profanity-laced jokes that I can't post on the New York Times website, but but they're there. So that's absolutely the truth. In the north, you've seen towns or villages where there's civil organizing going on. People will get together and they will organize the school system for themselves. They'll organize fire trucks. They'll organize disaster response at the bakeries. I haven't been in grad school for a while, so I'm not quite sure where the boundaries of civil society or what that means, but obviously you have all these Islamist groups. That might be controversial to call those guys civil society because a lot of what they do is not particularly civil often, but in terms of non-governmental organizations and people banding together and trying to do something for themselves, I mean, that really is the story of the Syrian uprising. Unfortunately, those things have often been violent or negative, but, I remember when I was in school, there was a textbook we read called Overstating the Arab State. And I think, that's, in this case at least, and in many cases, the weakness of the state and the strength of the people has really been abundantly clear the past several years. Certainly in Syria, in places where the state has really receded and where you have, no systemic alternative has emerged. You'll have, a town council that governs the town and its volunteers. It might be people who were plumbers or teachers or whatever else before, and they've stepped in to fill that role. So that's definitely true. I think if you're not seeing it reported, that is probably a corollary of what I said earlier, which is the extreme difficulty or risk that reporters face going in from the outside, or that Syrians face, when you have your name attached to something that gets printed internationally. And I'm not sure how you deeply handle that, but I know often at the Times it'll say just an employee of the New York Times in Syria contributed or wrote this story, because people don't want to, plant their flag there and put their name out. So I think that could be part of the dilemma. I forgot your other questions. I'm sorry. There were several of them.
I can jump in there.
Yeah.
I feel your pain. Civil society has been so neglected, and that's such a key part of the story, and it is the thing that the future of Syria will be built on. So I think it definitely warrants observation. Even, you look at broad swaths of Syria. If I were going to rewrite this title of Overstating the Arab State, it would be Overstating the Islamic State right now, because Dawla isn't everywhere. In the southern parts of the country, as you know, and around Damascus, there really isn't an al-Qaeda presence substantially as there might be in pockets of the north. And we overstate them. I know that is probably why you asked the question. But also places like Kafranbel, which became famous for publishing these posters and these calls to the world that your silence is killing us, went quiet over the summer. They stopped doing their famous posters because they thought no one was listening anymore. So the perception of whether or not we're paying attention actively shapes what's happening on the ground. And if we don't pay attention to those elements that you might want to see flourish, they're not going to flourish. And they're not going to feel like anyone's paying attention to what they're trying to accomplish by picking up the trash or teaching school or have some semblance of normal life, which gets to another question. I think I'm hearing the thing that's woven under your various questions, which is what's really going on here. And there is a reality check. When you talk about the state of political aid, I'll speak on behalf of wonderful aid groups who can't say this publicly, but and there have been some open reports on this as well. It's not accidental that life is so miserable in parts of the country. It's a deliberate strategy. Human misery is a weapon of war these days. And to say that if an area is cleared of regime presence, it will almost the next day be pummeled by rocket fire and aerial bombardment. And basically, the regime has made life unlivable anywhere that it doesn't control. So it's no accident that those are the places where people are starving and are also the hardest places for aid groups to reach. And this is a reality I hear from the most plugged in and reputable sources, in Carolyn's kind of nodding, so they can't say it out loud. So the politics of aid get very tricky. And why are we treating them as equal right now when clearly one side is using heavy artillery on civilian areas? And that is a fact that gets overlooked now because of the dominance of the al-Qaeda narrative, because of this need to balance when you come to chemical weapons, this fact that the Assad regime is now a legitimate player diplomatically, but how do you account for the fact there have been war crimes? By and large, consequences for any war crimes are off the agenda for the moment. The president, Assad, has left it open whether he'll run for president again next year, which where would you count the votes? How would you monitor? How would you secure the monitors? If you can't do it for chemical weapons inspectors, how are you going to do it to try to pull off an election? So where are they going to count the votes? In the places they're from control? So, I think we've lost the plot, and because of that, some basic realities that you were in touch with, living on the ground there, have almost no place in the narrative. And as a result, a month ago, when we had a chance, a very brief window, to have a national conversation about Syria, we had the wrong conversation about Syria because we didn't factor in all of these clear realities. We just took little reductive narratives and then went on and on about them hour after hour of each cable talk show, which is really a shame because that was our chance to have a conversation. And now we're here.
So 2 points I would make. The first one is, to be really clear, the vast majority of aid inside Syria is being delivered by Syrians, not by outside forces or outside aid agencies. It is absolutely by Syrian civilians. That is who is doing the vast majority of the delivery of services of every type, whether you're talking about food or water or medical services or setting up a garbage collection, or it is absolutely Syrians that are doing that. So I think that's, and I think the role of the aid agencies like Save the Children is to try, first of all, to get supplies into people that will deliver that aid, to get deeper and deeper into these pockets of places where there literally are now people who have not received any kind of outside services or aid for, months and months, probably going on a year in some parts of Syria. So to be able to get that supply chain going is really important. The only way that aid agencies can do it is to talk about neutrality. That's the only way. So that's what we do. That's what we talk about, because that's what we're there to do. So that's why we talk about it that way, because it's the only way to try to get that supply to widen and deepen and to get more and more of that help into the places that really need it, which is going to be delivered mostly by Syrians. So.
Well, just two quick points. I think it's clear that indeed the more this war goes on, the smaller the space for a civil society, because in a war like that, it's those who have guns who dominate. There's a certain logic to that. On the weapons issue, of course, the government gets support from Russia, from Iran, but does that mean that then there has to be a race in giving more weapons? I think it would just go up and up. And I think there's a kind of more, I can understand if you are a Syrian living in Syria that you decide to fight, including with the risk of your own death, because you think that is the only solution from your standpoint, and I think it's a very respectable and courageous position. But I think when you're an outsider, there's a kind of moral hazard in just saying, "Oh, let's give them weapons so that they can fight it out." I feel uncomfortable with that position.
Gülsün Arman, Million Newspaper Turkey and Dakamusha Journalism Fellow at the UN. So I have two questions. The first one is for Carolyn Miles. You have praised the Jordanian and Iraqi governments to tackle the refugee crisis. And how would you evaluate Turkey's response to refugee crisis? And the second question is for Mr. Geno. You said that the real conflict is actually not in Syria, but in Sunni monarchies and Iran. How would you evaluate Turkey in this type of framework? Thank you.
So on the first question, in terms of Turkey's response to the refugees, I would have to be honest with you and say that I do not think it's been a very strong response by the Turkish government. I think the efforts in Turkey have been about keeping Syrians inside Syria. There has been a lot of cooperation over the border to try to enable aid to go back and forth over the Turkish border. So from that standpoint, so that's the strategy in Turkey, unlike the strategy in Jordan and Iraq, which is to let people come over the borders, and Lebanon as well, and Egypt. In Turkey, the strategy is different. The strategy is keep Syrians inside Syria and enable aid to go across the border of Turkey. So I would say I don't know if I would say it's a bad strategy, but it's different. It's definitely different than what Jordan and Iraq and Egypt are doing in terms of the refugee, and Lebanon are doing in terms of refugees. Yeah.
Well, I think Turkey has had a very ambitious policy in the former Ottoman Empire, with the notion that it was going to reestablish links and friendships of past history. And in the case of Syria, initially Mr. Erdogan tried to be a mediator. That didn't work. I think that frustrated a lot the Turkish leadership. And then the Syrian war, because, of course, most Arab countries have a Sunni majority, was seen by Turkey also as a way to establish its credentials with Sunnis in the Arab world, and in the context of also a certain nervousness if the most influential power in Syria was going to become, let's say, Saudi Arabia. That would not appeal to Turkey. So there's a kind of competition that started there. I personally think that it's not a very healthy competition, and that it doesn't serve the best interest of peace in Syria. That being said, I think Turkey, from a strategic standpoint, has a much stronger interest than Saudi Arabia in having a peaceful Syria, because it has a long border with Syria. And the continuation of the conflict in Syria can have an impact on the Kurdish question that has been managed by Turkey with the Kurdish leadership in the Iraqi Kurdistan. There has been also internally with Öcalan. There was some progress, although it's precarious, but there was some progress. I think if the war continues the way it continues in Syria, it will eventually hurt Turkey on a fairly strategic issue for Turkey.
Next question.
Hi, thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Brian Sievett. I am a graduate student at NYU University, and I concentrate in environment policy. Hence, my question is going to focus on climate change, or what a colleague of mine calls catastrophic climate destabilization. I suppose I'll direct this towards panelist Miles, since you mentioned the topic of a hunger crisis and displaced persons. That leads me to my question. What role did the drought in Syria play that lasted from 2006 to 2010 play in the lead up to the conflict in Syria? Does the lack of arable land perhaps play a part in prolonging the conflict? And do the impacts of climate change present a destabilizing factor in the region for further conflict to escalate?
So I'm not sure if I can answer that whole question, but I can talk about the food insecurity inside of Syria. So that has definitely been a factor. And the drought that you spoke about, there was an underlying issue of food insecurity inside the country. So when the conflict started, you already had a situation where you had low food stocks, you had low harvests because of the drought there. And so you were starting from a place that was not giving you a lot of leeway in terms of people's ability to have enough food to go on, given the instability inside of Syria. So that certainly has had an impact. I'm afraid I can't talk more on the climate change issues in the region. It's not something that I know enough about to give you an answer. But certainly in terms of the hunger issue, it's absolutely a contributing factor. Yeah.
I think that we can also make an argument connecting that to the way that the uprising and the conflict played out, at least in its first year, in its early months. We did see it as a conflict that was kind of going from the periphery into the urban centers of the country. So it was largely a rural uprising at the beginning. It was affecting small towns, agricultural communities. It had been affected by years of drought, by crop failures, and by the consequent increase in rural poverty. And I think that at least goes part of the way towards explaining the shape the uprising took in its first year or so. I think what's often seen as being a sectarian model for how things unfolded often overlooks the kind of rural and urban dynamics and the economic dynamics at play also.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Steve Frenzy. I'm a first-year grad student here at SIPA. It seems like most of the discussion thus far has been centered on conflict resolution in Syria as the reestablishment of the integrity of the Syrian state as it's existed for the last 100 years. What is the feasibility at the international level of pursuing a more radical solution, such as allowing some of the mandatory borders from the League of Nations 100 years ago to essentially disappear and allow self-determination within the Syrian state to redraw some of the borders from that region, essentially allowing the sectarian groups to police themselves as opposed to constantly fighting over control of the Syrian state from Damascus? And if that's not feasible as an international course of action, how do you propose that the international community mitigates the fallout from sectarian fracturing as the conflict produces, similar to what we saw at the height of the Iraq insurgency in 2006 when it was nothing but Shia and Sunni violence?
Well, excuse me. I think, as I said earlier, the only imaginable, plausible settlement, and settlement's probably not quite the right word, but the only way to, in my view, dampen down the violence and reduce this catastrophe and perhaps contain it inside Syria's borders is through some kind of a partitioning of the country, and that will take outside consensus. It will take the legitimacy of some sort of, I think, a UN Security Council resolution or action. It will take exquisite timing to get this at the right moment when there's relative transient but relative territorial stability on all sides of the conflict. What you're doing essentially is abandoning the more hopeful solutions, which is a political settlement, which I think is implausible, and in fact is a danger to the extent that you pursue it, because if you pursue it aggressively enough, you end up with not all sides at the table. And you end up with a political solution, but with the Islamists on the outside, which then become spoilers of whatever that settlement happens to be. So, the political settlement can be, as some people conceive of it, can be the enemy of what's possible. And I think what's possible, though not likely, is some kind of an understanding among outside powers to reduce arms shipments and financial flows to the combatants, and to impose some sort of outside forces on the borders, informal borders between the various sides in the conflict. It's not going to stop the conflict. I mean, the rebel-held areas will continue to be violent. There'll be an ongoing military contest between secular opponents and Islamic opponents, and there'll be competition among the Islamists. So this is not a solution. This is not peace. This is not political power sharing. But I think it's probably about the best you can do. As far as the region as a whole, the fact is there really is no appetite globally to become deeply involved in fixing these problems. I know our country doesn't have the appetite. I don't think the Russians do. The Chinese certainly don't. And so I think you operate within with some sense of realism, which is that you might generate and maintain a consensus on behalf of containing these sectarian fissures within the Middle East, and you can provide sort of palliative care to these failing states. You can reduce the degree of misery, but you're not going to fix the region. You're not going to fix it based on existing borders, and you're not going to fix it based on future borders. And it's a sad conclusion. But this is not a moment for heroic deeds in the Middle East. None of the major powers have the appetite or the capacity or the will to do that.
Yeah, I think I disagree in the sense that I think it may well be the end game. It might be the end game if the war goes on, but in my view, it's a catastrophic scenario. For Syria, and for the Middle East. For Syria, because any decent Syrian that you meet, prides himself or herself on the fact that Syria indeed has been, for centuries, a very diverse country. And if you look at the map of Syria, the detailed map of Syria, these are not neat areas where you would have the Sunnis there, the Christians here, and the Alawite in a third place. It's a leopard skin, except for the east, some of the eastern part of the country. And so what it means is that the ethnic cleansing that is already ongoing will just reach new levels. And that would be horrible news. That means many more people killed than what we have seen already. Today, in government-held areas, in part for the reasons that Lara was saying, there are lots of Sunni IDPs along the coast. There are many more Sunni living now on the coast than before the conflict. So they are kicked back. All that is a history, is a tragedy like the partition of India and Pakistan. It's a horrible thing happening, and it will mean also it opens question on it redraws the map of other countries in the Middle East. It's the whole dispensation post-World War I, post-Ottoman Empire that is reopened. That is not good news for the Middle East. And so really the challenge for the solution in Syria is that for a short period in the history of Syria, the Alawite have been dominant. It's recent. They have usually been the poor cousin for centuries. And they are terrified of being thrown back into that position of the underdog. And that's why, although the regime hasn't treated them well, they stick with it because they are very afraid of the alternative. The Sunnis, the Al-Qaeda threat is exaggerated, but it is nevertheless there. And beyond Al-Qaeda, there are a number of jihadists who are a real, military phenomenon. And so down the road, you will need some kind of coalition of the Sunnis allied with others, Alawites, Christians, to crush the most extreme elements. That there is no end solution without that. And so I think if you want a long-term stabilization, you cannot think of a partition of Syria in homogeneous sectarian regions.
All of you students of political science are going to have a very interesting few years ahead, considering how to protect minority rights in the Syrian context and whether a confessionalist system like we see in Lebanon is the only option, as suboptimal as it might be. Because I think there are very big questions here around how these systems will cope with any transition to a new social contract, and one that no one is in a position to have a level-headed conversation about right now.
I'm just going to use the chair's prerogative to jump in on this question. I mentioned that I was beginning some research this summer about the question of what kind of governing institutions and political arrangements have begun to emerge in rebel-controlled or contested areas. And initially, we conceived of the project as studying one governorate compared to another governorate to try and establish patterns of what sort of institutional arrangements were emerging. And what we were told repeatedly was that is a far too large of a unit of analysis. And this, I think, speaks to Jean-Marie's point and is why I would be very cautious about a conception of partition as an option. Even within small towns or individual cities, the story that you hear is about different factions representing different constituencies that were previously living together. Some of those communities, whether along sectarian lines or other, have been displaced, but that's where their homes were. Parallel local councils operating alongside Sharia courts simply within a single municipality, which gives, I think, a picture of how interwoven these communities have been living together, but also gives you a sense of what the questions will be that emerge around what the logic will be of how the state is organized if and when the Assad regime falls. The questions are not simply around sectarianism, right? The questions are also around, will the state be more or less Islamist? Will the state be able to operate in a way that doesn't allow for the kinds of corruption and economic disparities that seem to be very much part of the narrative of the last several years? None of those questions really lend themselves to an easy partition of the country. So I just wanted to throw that in.
One thing I would add too, I think, all of us here for the most part are looking at the conflict from the outside and thinking these questions from the outside. And I think it's important when you're talking about a conflict that began as, a very idealistic uprising just weeks after Mubarak had fallen. Gaddafi was on the ropes in Libya. I think it's important to remember that these things began because people wanted to have more of a say in their own lives. And I think if we're going to talk about what the outside world, how we can fix Syria, how we can help Syrians, how we can do X, Y, and Z, I think it's important to think about what Syrians want for themselves and to make sure that they're involved in this process and that they have a seat at the table. Because at the end of the day, it is no less oppressive for the outside world to come in and say we're going to undo these boundaries and draw you new ones than it was to draw those boundaries in the first place. So I think that's important to say and to put out there in this conversation.
The only thing I would add, there is one other thing that's happening in Syria, which is Iraq, and the Kurdish government of northern Iraq has been very welcoming to the Kurds. And so there are tens of thousands of Kurds that are leaving Syria and going to Iraq. And so you have to think of what's happening there. The Iraqi government has been very, very supportive, or the Kurdish government, not the Iraqi government, the Kurdish government has been very supportive of that happening. So there are many, many Kurds who may never go back to Syria. So,
which also does raise the other issue of, what other states have, like what stake do they have in this issue? I think the central Iraqi government is not going to look kindly on a partition of Syria, whereas the Kurdish government in Iraq might really like that.
Yeah. That's certainly what it looks like when you're there and you see what they're doing to.
I'm sure they're thrilled.
Yep.
We have time for about 2 or 3 more questions.
Hi. My name is Zoe. I'm a dual degree student here at SIPA and the School of Public Health. I wondered if you might be able to speak a little bit more about the state of the opposition. I think kind of early on in the crisis, it was looking more like a kind of united opposition, and they were kind of looking forward to a lot of at least U.S. support for their movement. And that support seems to kind of be disappearing rapidly as the balance is kind of tipped more towards the regime. And so I was just wondering kind of what kinds of feelings about the future and about unity and these kinds of things you're getting from your sources on the ground, and if you could speak a bit to that. Thanks.
I think it's a fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked it. I think the story of the opposition is basically a story of an increasing number of players, which is why I think it looks more fragmented. It was always fragmented. Syria's opposition was never unified. I joke that they make the Lebanese look united. Sorry, Syrians. You heard me make that joke before. But, it was always fragmented. It's just that there are more players now, so it's even harder to conceive of how you get everyone aligned on one notion of a peace talk. So that's happened. But also, you all know by now, and you're smart enough to have tracked this in real time, that al-Qaeda wasn't a factor in the beginning. They became a factor in the vacuum that was created because no one stepped in to back the moderate side in a way that gave them a decisive sort of legitimacy on the ground. They still don't have that legitimacy. And we covered the day, literally, it was in great color that didn't all of it make it into our article, but the day a couple weeks ago when practically we had in Raqqa, you had like more than 1,000 FSA soldiers join Jabhat al-Nusra. And they called our reporter in Beirut to say, we're joining Jabhat al-Nusra to protect ourselves from al-Qaeda, the state of al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. So we're joining Jabhat al-Nusra to protect ourselves from ISIS, but we're doing it because we as moderate secular, well, they don't say secular, but moderate, well, they don't say that either, but they say as FSA type. Well, they don't say secular because it makes people think atheist and that's a bad thing. And they don't say moderate because, like, excuse me, who are we to say, it's a stamp of approval. But they were FSA affiliated, non-aligned, and then the rivalry between the two al-Qaeda linked groups got so intense they felt they had to join one. We've also spoken to groups who do call themselves secular in Salamiyeh who say we have a month and a half left of operating budget. We have defectors in the Syrian army who want to join us, and we're telling them to stay put because we don't have guns for you. We don't have a way to get your family out. We don't have money. We're out of it. We used to have patrons with rich Salamiyeh expatriates in Latin America. They're not paying up anymore. So those are the dynamics on the ground when you talk about the state of rebels, right? If you want to fight, or if you've already taken a side and you're now kind of locked in, you kind of have to go with who has the strength on the ground to protect you and to continue to give you ammunition. And, so these are very basic human calculus on the ground as to who you support. Now, I think that, the U.S. is kind of making a classic and repeated policy blunder by putting so much behind an external opposition in exile that we've learned doesn't tend to have so much leverage over the state of the conflict, over any sort of negotiated peace, or on whatever happens the day after. Now that's dangerous, not just because it's unwise or looks silly or irrelevant to people on the ground, which it does, but because you're creating another player. You're creating another node. So now they're going to be are they going to speak at Geneva? But they can't enforce. So the regime, technically, if you were in a rational world, the regime doesn't need to negotiate with people in Washington and Doha and Istanbul. It needs to negotiate with the people who are fighting them on the ground. But if you can't get them represented, so how's that going to work? And who's the official designated prime minister of the opposition? Well, who's their constituency? It gets more difficult, not more kind of facilitated to sort things out because of that state of play. And you do have, although it's really interesting, that doesn't mean that there's no one on the other side of Assad. There are, I'm going on and on here, but there are political families, historical political families, Sunni political families, the Attasis and others, and the Shisheklis, who they are their own power centers. They have their own constituencies. Whether they'll rise or if you were to hold election for mayor tomorrow, would it be one of the, who knows, right? There are people within the regime who still have people's hope as, okay, you know what, this guy's relatively clean. Could he play a role in a transition? Or who's on the ground from the next generation? This comes at a time when the LCCs are telling us we're running out of moderates on the ground. I'm like, really? Why? Because they're dying, because they're being shot at. Oh, okay. So, but will there be enough of them left to, learn how to play politics the day after? Those are that's going to be the legitimate opposition in Syria. So all of that is the answer to your question.
Sir, before I let you ask another, I think there's somebody who hasn't had a chance yet.
Hi. Thank you for organizing this panel. I think it's great. I'm Alex Humanitarian. I work for the Dutch peace organization IKB Pax Christi, which has been working on local civil society initiatives in Syria for more than a decade. And I think everything that you've said about civil society in Syria is spot on. These were challenges before the conflict broke out. They've been a problem in Syria for 40 years. And I could go on and on about that, but I won't because I think you've been very articulate in what you said. So I have a very simple and short question, which is that I work at the UN level, and everyone's lauding this Security Council resolution as this huge political breakthrough. Oh, everything's going to be wonderful now, so on and so forth. It's a resolution that's resolving to resolve something maybe in the future, but 2% of the weapons would kill more than 100,000 people. So I was wondering if you two had any reflections from Syrian people about this Security Council resolution, if anything whatsoever.
To borrow a British phrase, they think it's bollocks. They really think, they feel completely toyed with, furious, left alone. They wonder, this was a year ago, they were asking, do Americans know what's happening? Because we cannot believe that they know and would let it go on. They have a higher opinion of us than we deserve sometimes. So they feel very deceived. In some cases, they felt they were told, and so they felt like it was game on for a U.S. strike. They were told when to expect it. They expected to wake up to it. It seems like that's not surprising to you, but this is something we hear from them. You had rebels who were asked by the field commanders, who's where's Al Qaeda, like really granular details that they assumed were being passed up through the Supreme Military Command to their allies in the West. So they felt like it was really going to happen, and that was, the picture moves so fast that no answer holds for more than a day. But at that point, even though Syrians didn't want their country bombed, they understood the need for it because they felt that it would impose a check on air power, Assad's use of air power to bomb civilian areas. So when that didn't happen, they're like, thanks for not stopping him from bombing us. And then the celebration does seem perverse to Syrians who think that something needs to be done to end this war, and now you've just basically extended it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. As strongly as many people Syrian people did not want their country to be attacked by an outside power, there were people involved, on the level of combat, actually in the field, who I think were in some level looking forward to having a little bit of assistance. And so I think a lot of people actually doing the fighting were very upset by that. I think, it just goes to underscore again how divorced a lot of the conversations happening at the international level and at the diplomatic level are from, I think, what Syrians on the ground think, feel, and want. These are people who are not really being consulted about the big political decisions affecting their country and affecting their fate. So I think that's my first reflection on that.
I remember when I was in Syria a little more than a year ago, there was already the expectation that Syria would be saved by NATO. And I was trying to tell my interlocutors that they were very naive about that. That is not going to happen, which make me popular. And so I would absolutely understand that now they are even more confused. And I think the whole rhetoric of the military action to save the day has made things worse, not better.
Could I just weigh in just for a moment? If we've established that there'll be no forceful outside intervention in the civil war, it's not going to happen. We're not going to do it. The Russians aren't going to do it. That if we continue on the road that we're on, the violence will escalate without any decisive edge for any side. I mean, most civil wars end when one side wins. This is not going to end that way. So there's no end in sight as long as outside powers continue to sort of competitively intervene indirectly by providing arms to various sides. There's no political settlement in the offing. I think that's quite clear. We all pretty much agree that there's no consensus among this multi-sided conflict. No incentive, no consensus, no agreement, a determination on the part of the opponents, both secular and Islamists, not to sit down with the regime. And the regime is right now feeling pretty good about itself. It just, in a sense, got thrown a lifeline by the chemical weapons agreement. So it at least feels as if it's operating from a position of strength. There's no basis for a conversation internally. What are you left with? If you understand what can happen, if all the theoretical, conceivable routes to a settlement are unavailable, you suppress your enthusiasm. You dampen down your own expectations. You try to ameliorate. You try to manage. You try to make conditions better. I'm not an enthusiastic advocate of partition. It's a terrible solution. The question is whether it's the least bad, plausible response, some combination of leveraging this fledgling consensus among outside powers to stop feeding the conflict, and a determination also to be watchful about whether there's a moment when some reasonable partition, and it may come after subsequent ethnic cleansing. I mean, it may not be the right time to do this. And there will be additional lives lost and additional humanitarian disasters. Syria will remain a killing field for some time to come. But if you can save some lives by this inelegant response, you still probably ought to do it. Otherwise, you continue to entertain, fantasies about how to resolve this. We have wasted 3 years. The solutions that may have been available to us a year ago, 2 years ago, are no longer available. The opposition is radicalized and fragmented. The regime is intransigent. You've lost these opportunities. And just think for a moment about what this world looks like with a superpower ourselves that is now quite determined not to invest its power and influence in situations like this. I mean, Iraq was a catastrophe, obviously, and was a terrible mistake. But this is the flip side of Iraq, an administration that is quite determined to kind of work around the edges of this, invest its political capital in an exiled political opposition that it knows quite well, right, is not going to be the solution to this problem. I mean, we're not really investing any faith in this opposition. It's the only thing that we can claim to be invested in. So this is what internal conflict in critical regions of the world looks like, without an outside consensus and with a hegemonic power that's retrenching. I mean, this is what the world is going to look like, I think, for some time to come. So I mean, I don't think a region-wide redrawing of the map is a solution. I can't imagine that would curb the violence. I mean, that process of redrawing boundaries is bound to be violent. If that's the downside, if that's the worst it can get, then work against that worst-case scenario by trying to contain the conflict inside Syria and trying to dampen down the level of violence inside that country. Right? That's what you can do. And it's not good, but it's a hell of a lot better than where you get with an entirely redrawn Middle East map, redrawn not through, negotiations, but through ethnic cleansing and population movements and conflict.
Yes.
I have to speak because I really disagree. I deeply disagree. I think it is true that the victors of World War I exported to the Middle East the nation state to replace the Ottoman Empire. And the nation state may be a formula that has seen better days. And that will have to evolve not just in the Middle East, all around the world. That's one thing to say. But then I think it would be a second curse on the region to say, okay, in a typically Western curse, because so we have we can only have one political model at a time. So we gave you the nation state. Okay, you don't like it? No, now we read everything in the Middle East in sectarian terms. And I am the one who said, yes, there's a Sunni monarchies and Iran. I didn't say Sunni, the epic battle between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. I said between the Sunni monarchies and Iran. That is different. And it happens that Iran is dominated, it's a Shia, largely Shia country, although there are other religions in Iran, including Christians. But to now impose on the Middle East this sort of I think simplification that you have to put all the complexities of the Middle East in the boxes of religion and sectarianism.
No, I'm sorry, but that's not what I was suggesting.
I have to caricature you to contradict you a bit.
If we want to have a disagreement, we can invent one. But I really said I don't think that redrawing all the boundaries in the Middle East is the solution. What I said that if you want to avoid that process, which will be violent and destabilizing, that you need to try to work to contain the violence inside Syria. Okay.
Yes, but then you say to contain the violence inside Syria, put various Syrian groups, each in its confessional box. And I think that is easier said than done. And I doubt that long term that is what the Syrians will want. And it's reading Syria only through the sectarian lens, while there also the tribal dimension in Syria, which is, I mean, in some parts of Syria it's very important. There are different levels at which you can read the society. And to put them just in the confessional box, I think is a dangerous idea that will just create more violence than help solve it.
So what's the better idea?
Oh, that's a long one. Well, I think that's what we have been discussing in the last 2 hours.
I think
sorry, I've gotten the message from the power that be, which is who is Aaron Banco, that we are going to have to leave on that very loaded rhetorical question of what is the other solution, and take it over some wine and cheese. Maybe we can get to that piece of the debate. I want to thank all of the panelists very much for joining us for a lively and sobering discussion, and thank you again to Aaron for organizing.